Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for the first session of this year's Crucial Conversation series on confronting anti-Semitism. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for this series, Nancy Ann and Ray L. Hunt, in memory of Barbara Rabin, Texas Instruments, and the City of Dallas Office of Arts and Culture. We are so grateful for your support of the museum and this important series. I would also like to extend our thanks to our community partners for tonight's events. AJC Dallas, Congregation Shereth Israel, Faith Forward Texas, Jewish Family Services of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Resource Center, Temple Emmanuel, Temple Shalom, and the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Thank you all so much for your support and partnership. And last but not least, I would like to give a warm welcome to our museum members and to our board members. Your support is crucial to our mission. Thank you for all you do to support the museum. Last year, we started the Crucial Conversation series to create a space to discuss a pervasive institutional issue in our country, racism. We wanted to give ourselves permission to feel uncomfortable, to take risk, to embrace open communication, but most importantly, we wanted to build a framework to educate and to share information. Often, the topics that are the hardest to talk about are the topics we most need to address. This year, we are confronting anti-Semitism, a hatred that has existed for millennia and is the root of the Holocaust Shoah wing of the museum's permanent exhibition. In this series, we aim to foster an increased understanding of the origins and history of anti-Semitism, to discuss the recent increase in anti-Semitism globally and in the US, and to identify concrete steps that can be taken to confront and disrupt anti-Semitism. As a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we are intimately familiar with the historical consequences of a hatred like anti-Semitism, which is fueled by conspiracy and misplaced blame. But anti-Semitism did not start or end with the Holocaust. Just as the Jews in the Middle Ages were blamed for the Black Plague, Jews have recently been accused of creating and spreading the coronavirus. Anti-Semitic tropes of Jews as greedy or power-hungry are as pervasive today as they were in past centuries. We cannot be complacent when virulent anti-Semitism is still so present in our world. Tonight, we will start the conversation by establishing a knowledge base and defining some terms related to anti-Semitism. In our second and third sessions, we will discuss anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world before concluding the series with a session on strategies to combat anti-Semitism. We'll do our best to leave time for questions at the end of tonight's discussion. And I'd like to ask that you try to focus your questions on the topics we are covering tonight and save questions related to future sessions for those programs. Last year, many of you were frustrated with us that we weren't jumping right into the conversation about taking action. I promise we'll get there. Because we have so much to talk about tonight, this program may run a little longer than usual, but we are recording it. So you can always come back to it if you need to step away at some point. It will be on the DHHRM YouTube channel in a day or two. I'm so pleased tonight to have such an esteemed partner in conversation. Dr. Mark Weitzman is Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is a member of the U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, the IHRA, where he was the architect of IHRA's adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism and lead author of IHRA's working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. He also serves as the Vice President of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. Mark is co-editing the Routledge History of Anti-Semitism and is a contributor to the forthcoming volumes, Contending with Anti-Semitism in a Rapidly Changing Political Climate and the Cambridge History of Antisemitism. Mark, if you'd like to join me, we'll dive right in. Welcome.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's really a privilege to be here and to be a part of this effort that you're doing with the museum. I think those of us who have worked on the Holocaust in the field of anti-Semitism and human rights in general realize the impact of the Holocaust, if it is going to have any meaning, has to have a practical impact in today's world as well, and not just be an historical subject. And I really can't think of any better way to bring that forward than the kind of efforts that you and the museum are doing. So thank you very much for that, and to all those who are supporting you.
Thank you so much. And we are so grateful for your incredible work at the Wiesenthal Center and with the IHRA. So it's making a huge difference, and it's just an honor to be in conversation with you tonight. I'd like to give a quick preface to some of the questions that I'll be asking Mark. Wanted to remind you that we didn't want to assume that all of us are starting with the same basic knowledge. Many of our visitors are not Jewish. Many of the school children who come to the museum are not Jewish. And some of the questions that I am asking Mark tonight are questions that our educators receive on a regular basis. So we want to make sure that everyone joining us on this journey really has, a common starting point. So, Mark, to that end, I'd like to start by asking how you define what a Jew is. What
I'm almost
seems like a softball, but
with, yeah, and I'm going to say I'm almost tempted to begin with one of those classic, lines about how Jews don't agree about anything amongst themselves. Including and starting with the basic definition of who is a Jew. It is a matter of a great deal of contention today, and there are many different ways of looking at it. If you look at it historically through the ages, the traditional religious belief of who is a Jew is anybody who was born to a Jewish mother, who was matrilineal by descent, and that was the basic yardstick and measure for generations and for a long time. Today's world, we have different ways of looking at identity and different interpretations of identity. And so you have people who, and branches of Judaism that have now embraced patrilineal descent, meaning that anyone who has one Jewish parent, either a father or mother, or obviously two Jewish parents, can and is a member of a Jewish, the Jewish world and community. But you also have, certainly you have non-religious Jews and atheist Jews and agnostic Jews and secular humanist Jews who don't define themselves by any religious identity or definition. You have Jews who claim just an ethnic heritage, but then you splinter off into different ethnicities and different races. You have Jews of color who are now becoming much more vocal than have ever been before, certainly in the United States. And you have Jews from the Middle East and the so-called Mizrahi Jews and the Sephardic Jews from the Mediterranean basin, who come from, very different from the stereotypical Eastern European Jew, let's say. So one of the difficulties with anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism is the fact that even defining who the target is not a simple issue. And that was one of the reasons we ended up with the definition of anti-Semitism to try to encompass all these aspects of Jewish, I'll say, life in the broad sense of it. But for me, at least personally, since you asked me personally to begin with, I'm going to say when I look at it and approach it professionally, in terms of fighting anti-Semitism, my goal in fighting anti-Semitism is, in essence, twofold. One is particularly in relation to Jews. I want Jews of any stripe, however they define themselves and identify as Jewish, to have the space where they can live the type of Jewish life that they choose to and they want to live, free of fear, free of persecution, free of oppression. It is up to them to decide what kind of Jewish life they want to live. And I just want to be able to help give them that space to do that.
Right.
On the other hand, to make it a little bit larger, anti-Semitism is an issue that affects our society and culture in general. The United Nations, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, commissioned a report last year for the General Assembly by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief Ahmed Shahid. And Ahmed, who's a wonderful man, produced this extraordinary report about anti-Semitism. And one line of it stuck in my, I've been using it and quoting him, and ever since. And he wrote that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy.
Right.
And I think that sums it up perfectly, because it doesn't affect only Jews. It infects the society in which anti-Semitism flourishes and thrives.
Absolutely.
So there is a Jewish perspective and there's a broader perspective. And I try to operate on both aspects of that.
We have the Niemöller quote, in the Germany section of the museum, that where one group of people is oppressed, others will be as well. So to people that are, we have this desire to categorize people. Hitler, called the Jews a race, which we know is not the case, but it helped define them in a way that every man, woman, and child of Jewish descent could be a target. But so there's really not, they're an ethnicity, they're a people, some are religious, it's a culture, all of the above, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Right, it really is. And it's interesting. As you probably know, was it December 2019, President Trump announced an executive order applying this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to certain aspects of Title VI, which deals with the protection of students particularly on college campuses. So it's a civil rights issue related to the Department of Education, college campuses, and so on. And one of the reasons I think that the order was necessary was precisely because of, I'll say, the elasticity of the definition of who Jews are meant that in some ways they were falling through the cracks. The protections that were extended to other groups that are certainly necessary did not necessarily apply to Jews. You couldn't define Jews, let's say, by their color only, because there were Jews who are, as I am, I guess relatively, Anglo-looking, white-looking, whatever. But they were also Jews of color, clearly. They were Jews, as I said, it's not just religious belief, because there are Jews who don't believe anything. So it's necessary to kind of find a way to bring them under the protected umbrella that maybe had not been considered before. And that's one of the reasons why that narrowly defined executive order was generally applauded by most people.
Absolutely. And so you've mentioned the definition, IHRA's definition, several times. Could you share that with our audience and talk about the importance of coming up with this common vernacular, this common definition, and then going so far as to have spelling out examples so people could understand, that what anti-Semitism is?
So let me preface that by saying that one of the things that we did not aim to do was to create a new scholarly definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, and I always say this, I've taken part in when I was in grad school seminars on, the historiography of anti-Semitism. I could give one on, defining and again, the historiography of it that would probably last at least a semester and so on, because you can define it theologically, you can define it economically, you can define it through social sciences, you could define it historically, you can define it through literature, and et cetera, just keep going in that direction. We did not want to be part of that conversation. We wanted a definition that was much more practically oriented, that was a working definition, not in the sense of incomplete, but in the sense of being able to be put to work by people in the field, not people necessarily who are specialists in it, meaning that it could be something that policymakers can use to help guide their approaches to anti-Semitism. It did not mean that someone should be put in jail because they said something that the definition, considered anti-Semitic, but it meant that you could use it as a tool for identifying and calling it out.
Sure. And I just wanted to tell you, you probably are following this, but there are bills in the Texas Senate and House moving forward that would adopt the IHRA definition for the state of Texas and establish a commission on anti-Semitism.
You would be joining, I can't think of how many states offhand, I think it's 10, 15 already that are up to that, as well as over 30 countries that have adopted it. The largest group association of imams in the world, the Church of England, I think over 100 universities, including Cambridge and Oxford in the UK, and so on and so forth. But the definition itself is quite brief. The definition reads, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. But then, as you mentioned, we follow up with 11 examples.
Right.
But the examples, before we even get to the examples, we very specifically state that context matters. Anti-Semitism is not something, or the definition is not something that's like a rigid taxonomy or a legal code that, you spit on the street, you committed a misdemeanor. It's contextual in many ways, because we're talking about ideas, we're talking about actions. We're not necessarily, actually, it's much more action-oriented than idea-oriented, I should say. But it's not an assault on freedom of speech. And we say that in terms of one of the most, I guess, controversial parts of the examples are that a number of them related to Israel today.
Right.
Again, we felt the need to do that because especially after the Holocaust, extreme right-wing, let's say neo-Nazi anti-Semitism was pretty much understood by most people for what it is. You see a swastika, I think most people would say that that's a symbol of anti-Semitism.
Sure.
You see pictures of the Holocaust, that's the realization of anti-Semitism. But some of the recent manifestations were a little murkier. And I'll give you a concrete example to illustrate this. The definition was worked on in an IRA. It took a number of years to get it through. IRA is an intergovernmental organization, meaning that there are over 30 nations, and the delegations are headed by diplomats, and the work is political, diplomatical in nature. And to get something adopted in IRA, it functions by consensus, which means every country has to agree to it, or at least not oppose it. So you had to have agreement from 30 countries, including the ones where the Holocaust took place: Germany and Poland and Austria and France and the Netherlands and Lithuania and Croatia and Serbia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not a simple task. So it took a number of years to get it done. But in the summer of 2014, which is when the war in Gaza was taking place, there was a synagogue in a small town in Germany called Wuppertal. Wuppertal synagogue had been burnt down in 1938 in Kristallnacht, and they had built a different synagogue, and it was protected by very thick walls. And it turned out those walls were literally a lifesaver, because two people who were very upset about what was happening in Gaza took Molotov cocktails and firebombed the synagogue in protest or whatever. They confessed to it. They were arrested, confessed to it. Luckily, fortunately, no one was injured. I have slides. You can see the damage on the wall. But then a German court and then an appeals court ruled that that was not a hate crime, but it was an act of political protest. And the idea, it's hard to wrap our heads around it, the idea that firebombing a house of worship with people who have nothing to do with the actions going on thousands of miles away is not a hate crime. It's hard to understand. But that illustrated why we needed some sort of common baseline understanding of what anti-Semitism is. And factor in the fact that, as with so many other things, social media has become an extraordinary potent channel of communication that has globalized anti-Semitism. What happens in one corner of the world is now blown up all over the place. Basically, it goes viral in a second. We needed something that translated internationally, that translated through policymakers, academics, educators, museum memorials people in NGOs, civil society. Everyone could understand what it was and could work with it. That's the genesis of the IRA definition. That's what it's meant for. So we put together 11 examples. A number of them deal with issues related to the Middle East, like claiming that Israel is committing genocide, for example, which is, when you think about it, it's a claim that we hear all the time today, and has no basis in reality, because the Arab population rate is growing higher than the Jewish population rate in Israel, which is I would have to say it's a pretty poor way of committing genocide if you're letting the demographics go, in the opposite direction. Not to mention the political party in Israel that is currently the Arab Party, that is currently maybe perhaps in a position to dictate the results of the election. So,
Absolutely.
making a claim like that is clearly false and motivated by something else. But we also have examples of what we call traditional anti-Semitism. Calling for the murder of Jews for religious or ideological reasons fits right into traditional anti-Semitism. So we try to
And
take
T-shirts that say Camp Auschwitz, right?
yeah, and that's Holocaust denial. Actually, it's Holocaust distortion. It doesn't say that the Holocaust didn't happen, but it changes the meaning of what happened and diminishes the impact of that. We can spend a lot of time talking about Holocaust distortion.
Sure.
Because I think it's actually one of the key issues today, because it has political implications, not just in the US, but internationally. But leaving that aside, anyway, so this is why we came up with this definition, which has been a very long answer to your innocent question to begin with. So,
well, it's very, I would to everyone listening, I would commend to you to Google it, pull it up. It's very, unlike most official definitions. I love the context. It's easy to read, and I think the examples really help, shape an understanding of that's very needed.
You could find both definitions of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion on the IHRA website, which is holocastremembrance.com. You can find it on there. And by the way, to talk about lessons of the Holocaust and the wider implications of it, we just adopted last year a working definition of anti-Roma, because the Roma were also a significant target of the Nazis, and there are still major issues of persecution, right? And we realized that this was necessary as well to put it on the radar, and again, to have a baseline common denominator for people to use. So you can find that there as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So we've talked about this new definition. In my opening remarks, I said that, that anti-Semitism is millennia old. We often refer to it as the world's oldest hatred, but the term anti-Semitism is fairly recent, correct?
Correct.
Could you explain how that came about in 19th century? And
yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the term is generally traced back. Of course, scholars question or quibble about this, but it's generally attributed to a German publicist named Wilhelm Marr, who in the latter part of the 19th century decided he wanted to dignify the anti-Judaism of that time with a better, more, higher class title. So what Marr did was he tapped into what was the scientific vogue at the time, which was sort of, let's say, social Darwinism. In other words, the idea that it began with Darwin of the evolution of humanity, taxonomy of races, and so on. And Darwin was not an anti-Semite, and was not. I don't want to put Darwin in that position, but some people took Darwin's teachings in that direction. People like the Frenchman Jobineau and the Englishman / German Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Eugenicist in the United States.
And the eugenicist Madison Grant and so on in the United States. But that was 20th century, that was early 20th century. Anyway, so Marr decided he wanted to tap in and give it the pseudoscientific veneer. He didn't want to be associated with the street rabble who were, rioting and throwing stones against Jews. He wanted to put it on an intellectual footing and grounded in the latest scientific theory. So he came up with the idea of using this so-called taxonomy of races, Semitism. But there is no Semitism in reality, which is why most people involved in the field, including myself, tend to basically say that you should spell anti-Semitism without the hyphen as one word all the time, because Semitism is an artificial construct of Marr and those people that was meant really to, as I said, make it legitimate, scientifically legitimate, to target and hate Jews and discriminate against them.
And pave the way for the Nazis.
And that grew into the Nazi racial science. That was the basis of the Nazi racial science that obviously, again, led directly into the final solution. In the US, we had a lot of sympathy for that. And that's one of the places where racism and anti-Semitism come together and converge. is that some of the seminal figures in the United States, in some of the areas of science and medicine, anthropology and so on, Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant and people like that, were very influenced by that philosophy and try to import and enact it in the US as well.
So the age-old history is the hatred of Jews or the Jewish people. So anti-Judaism, if you will, sort of morphed into anti-Semitism. Do you see a difference in those two words?
It's still that is a scholarly debate these days. There are people who say that the word anti-Semitism itself, because it is so anachronistic in some ways, you can't read it back. And some scholars will actually say that it only began thousands of years ago at the time of the divergence between Judaism and Christianity. But before that, they will only use anti-Judaism. And the idea in many ways is that really this divergence of Judaism and Christianity, the necessity that Christianity felt to define itself against Judaism. Kind of, I always liken it to the teenager who is growing up in the parents' house and has to really push them away a little bit to get their own identity.
Yes, right? I remember that phase, right?
On both sides. As a parent, I remember on both sides.
Yes.
And it creates a lot of angst and tension, and sometimes doesn't turn out so well either. And in this case, really, you had I sometimes use this typology, this kind of thing this vision that a degenerate group, the Judaism had degenerated by the time of Jesus, and so God sent Jesus down to the Jews, who rejected him and committed the act of deicide, and thus were damned and sentenced to diaspora, to wandering, losing exile, losing their homeland. So I use that 4D kind of thing of degenerate, deicide, damned, and diaspora to sum it up. And that was a typology that existed really until post-Holocaust, until Vatican II in the Catholic Church, which was an extraordinary revolution. And some of the Protestant theologians who at the same time were reworking a lot of aspects of Protestant theology to keep their religion as they saw it should be, but to at least neutralize, if not remove, this terrible heritage of anti-Judaism within it. But that was the theme for centuries. It basically underrode, Christian Catholic theology. We're familiar with Luther and what he wrote in his book, in his tract on the Jews, where after trying to convert Jews to Lutheranism or to his followers, he turned against them and wrote some incredibly virulent and actually scary things if you look at it, because he was writing in Germany in 1540s, and 400 years later, you see what happened there. And he writes about burning Jewish books and forcing them out into exile and taking away their rights, and it's pretty scary. You don't like drawing direct lines, and as a historian, I won't draw. It's not simple cause and effect, but it is pretty scary.
Right.
And then you had the Enlightenment, which was a revolt against religion and revealed religion, but the source of revealed religion was the Bible. And the Bible particularly was associated with Jews, not just Christians. As a matter of fact, the Jews were the source of the Bible.
Right.
Christianity sprang from Judaism. So for Voltaire and some of the other philosophers of the Enlightenment, Jews became a target as well. And you read some of their stuff and it's outright anti-Semitic. So you had both enlightened and religious histories of anti-Semitism. You had the racial anti-Semitism that we just talked about. You had Karl Marx writing that Jews worship gold and were the capitalists par excellence and so on. So you had an sort of form of economic anti-Semitism. At the turn of the 20th century, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion came into knowledge, existence, and they were the source of what we can call conspiracy or conspiratorial anti-Semitism, alleging that a small group of Jewish wise men, were plotting to secretly control the governments of the world and take over the world. And so you had all these strands coming together that led to the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, most of these were no longer acceptable, at least in Western circles, at least in, I'll say, mainstream polite society and ruling, governments and so on and so forth. But their
prior
heritage,
to that, very, very widely accepted.
right? And it wasn't just words. If you go, I don't know if it was 2 years ago, there was that tremendous, catastrophic fire in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, where I know, many of us, including myself, were riveted watching this, and and all the commentary was about the potential destruction of one of the landmarks and a great heritage of Western civilization. And it's absolutely true, and it would have been a tragedy if it was destroyed. But what's fascinating is if you look at Notre Dame, one of the lintels, one of the doors, above one of the doors, are two statues which reappear in hundreds of places in Europe in different forms. One of a triumphant ecclesia, the church, which is standing straight, a young, strong woman in full bloom vigor with a staff upheld, and all these signs of life and being blessed and prosperous. And opposing her is synagogue, broken, hunched over, bent hunched over, broken staff, blindfold over their eyes, symbolizing the Jewish rejection of Jesus and God's punishment. So these were just not even verbal,
everywhere.
But they were everywhere. And from Shakespeare and Chaucer to T.S. Eliot, they're in Western literature, and it's David Nirenberg has written a lot about this. The phrase I use, it's structural. It's part of Western culture. That even if it's not overt, it still lingers in some aspects of it. And that has left its impact. And that we still haven't grappled with completely. That's something that we're still dealing with today.
And now, well, in the 20th century really emerges Zionism or anti-Zionism. So let's talk about, if you will, help our viewers understand, define Zionism and explain its origins.
Well, to me, Zionism is simply, I'll say, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It's the attempt or desire for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland and to have a national homeland, a land where they have roots, they have history, they have heritage, and they feel that they belong. It doesn't mean that Jews can't live anyplace else or have a higher loyalty to Israel. I mean, that's similar to what John F. Kennedy had to go through in when he made that famous speech in West Virginia, declaring that he's a loyal citizen of the United States and will not be ruled by the Vatican. It's a similar issue.
But you still hear that trope in the United States at all. If someone is a supporter of Israel, then they have dual loyalty, right?
Yeah, you still hear it, and we've heard it in Congress. We've heard it from some, quote unquote progressive congressman recently. The question of dual loyalty, and I think that's an anti-Semitic trope, honestly. It plays into this old idea that Jews cannot be loyal citizens. And we talked about the protocols, for example, which allege that Jews had this secret conspiracy, and it plays into this feeling and belief that still is around today. And I think one of the major issues or problems that we have are that some of the fringe beliefs and tropes and stereotypes have now been picked up by some mainstream figures, and that's an issue. But I think Zionism is, first of all, let me say that the existence of Israel did not cause anti-Semitism. As we talked about, anti-Semitism and Jew hatred existed before Israel. So if some people claim that if Israel didn't exist, that everything would be great with Jews in the world and there'd be no anti-Semitism.
Right.
At best, that's wishful thinking. At worst, that's a negative. That's just a consciously harmful misinterpretation of history.
Well, you have hundreds of years of evidence to the contrary.
Right. But and Zionism, and we tend to say that Zionism began in the end of the beginning of the 20th century, very end of the 19th century.
Herzl.
The reality is, with Theodor Herzl, exactly, who published his great book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in 1895, 1896. But the reality is that if you go to traditional religious Jews who prayed 3 times a day. In those prayers, 3 times a day from the time of exile in 70, kind of the Common Era after the Roman destroyed the Jewish Commonwealth and kingdom there, they've been praying 3 times a day for the return to Zion. There was never a period in history where there were no Jews living in Israel.
Next year in Jerusalem,
Every
right?
year, the Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem.
Right.
There were abortive movements in the
Mhm.
medieval period and elsewhere for Jews to return. In some of the false messianic movements were based and included a return to Zion. Even before Herzl, in certain religious circles, we'd call them probably more, I guess, modern Orthodox circles today, there were some what were called proto-Zionists, which were rabbis that had kind of nurtured without any idea what Herzl was doing in Vienna and Paris, but had nurtured ideas in the late 19th century that were very similar to what Herzl was coming up from a secular perspective.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So would you say that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitic?
Here's where that quote about context matters comes into play. In some ways, in a practical sense, we're probably close to that. In a theoretical sense, not necessarily. What I mean by a practical sense is that, yeah, sure, there are people who are quote unquote anti-Zionist who may be coming from a perspective where they don't believe in any national borders, or that any group of people should have a national homeland. And we'll say the same thing about the Scotch or the French or any group. If they're anti-Zionist, well, no, I can't say that that's necessarily anti-Semitic if that's where they're coming from, because they're criticizing Jews, in Israel, as they would criticize any other land. Haven't really met many people like that though recently. Most of the anti-Zionist critiques are based on either a political or ideological basis, and if you start plumbing those deeper, very often, not necessarily all the time, but very often you come upon a vein of anti-Semitism, which, and again, in different ways, if you're saying that Jews are the only people who can't have a homeland, then that's a double standard, which to me is, well, you see where that's going. If you say that, Israel should be absorbed by its neighbors or create one, larger state or something to that effect, well, the reality is that the roughly, I think, 9 million Jews in Israel today, the reality is you're exposing them to genocidal risk. And if you start putting people at large in a genocidal risk, that's not coming from a good place either. So every place you start parsing it a little bit, it just doesn't, the reality is that most of the anti-Zionism that I see comes from those kind of corners. If you're saying that, from a lot of the progressive circles, that Israel is, the equivalent of a Nazi apartheid state in its actions, that to me is an anti-Semitic claim. By the way, I want to say here that I don't think that everybody who says something anti-Semitic can be labeled as an anti-Semite. I think there's a distinction there. Some people repeat things without understanding them. Some people don't, will find a difference between what they say and what they really end up doing. It's not a simple thing, and I don't want to, target people unnecessarily.
And I think, I found people say anti-Semitic things without even realizing that they're doing it sometimes.
I agree.
That these horrible old sayings, to bargain someone, to Jew someone down. People grew up hearing, of course it's anti-Semitic, but people repeated that without even stopping and thinking what it meant. And we're doing that now with so many different words, but it's important to think about, the origin of those sayings and why.
I think you're right on target. And this goes back to what I said earlier, the kind of structural or unconscious anti-Semitism that can exist in many good-hearted people as well. And that's why I refuse to say that someone is necessarily anti-Semitic, even if they said or done something anti-Semitic, because there's potential in many cases to educate and to make people aware of what they did and the implications involved in it. And I prefer to go in that direction.
I do too. And give people, and and assume the best,
Right.
but
Exactly.
try to educate them and help them understand why it's not right. You know, so another huge issue that feeds into anti-Semitism you've referred to is the conspiracy theories, you know, with the protocols of the elders of Zion. And you know, I know that there have been conspiracy theories for millennia. You know, I spoke about the plague and the Jews poisoning the well in my opening remarks, but it seems that conspiracy theories in general are becoming more problematic. We had a conversation just recently, Mark, in our civil discourse series about conspiracy theories, and one of the scholars that spoke said he didn't feel that they were more prevalent now, that you know that they've always been around. So that was interesting, because it sure feels like they're more prevalent, and it may just be because of social media. But how do you, you know, I explain these far-fetched, you know, the latest that, you know, is so ridiculous that Jews had a secret space laser that created the California fires. You know, on the surface, it's almost laughable, but it's dangerous to laugh at that.
Well, I'm not sure it's dangerous to laugh at it, but it's dangerous to underestimate it.
Or to ignore. Yeah.
Or to ignore
Okay,
it.
well,
Exactly.
good. Because you have to laugh sometimes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I sometimes think that someone like Mel Brooks is the best answer to a lot of our issues.
Yeah, exactly.
But listen, I spoke earlier about the origins of what I'll say is sort of a religious-based anti-Semitism that has permeated with. But if you go back to that itself is a conspiratorial-based anti-Semitism, because it alleges that the Jewish elders, the Sanhedrin, the court of 70, were the ones who demanded Jesus' death, even after Pontius Pilate, said, no, I don't want to do it. They were the ones who forced the issue. They were the ones who were behind it. So if you go back to the very beginnings of this sordid story, it was, and if you even go earlier, if you want to go all the way back to the biblical narrative, to Genesis and the story of Joseph and Jews' slavery, what did Pharaoh say? That there's this large group of people who are in our country. They're foreigners. They don't have any allegiance to us. And if an enemy comes and attacks us, they might join them. This is, I mean, we're seeing this today.
Dual loyalty, right?
Dual loyalty,
or
enemies, undermine it. You could just, change the words around, stick it on social media, and there'd be people signing up, to it right now. So it's in some ways it's not new, and it's maybe part of the human condition.
So I'm curious about your thoughts of, so clearly there was anti-Jewish sentiment, there was hatred and prejudice before Jesus, and before the Jews were blamed for killing Jesus. Do you think some of that lies in the fact that as a people, that the religion has changed and the people have evolved, but this group of people have basically, held a religion and moved it forward for 3,000 years, and that's unusual, that has made them and marked them as different and made them an easy target?
I think there's definitely an element of truth to that. If you look at some of the classic, Christian theology, Augustine and others, it's the idea that Jews were to be protected because they had a role to play in the second coming, but they were never to be given equal rights, so to speak. And that, by the way, is Islam's perspective as the Dhimmiyid, except they applied it to Christians as well, is that these people are the people of the book. So there's a relationship, a familiar relationship to Islam, but they're never equal. They can't, synagogues can't be as high as mosques. You have to wearing identifying, star or a symbol was an element that both Islam and Christianity assigned to Jews in different places. So even if you were protected, but there was never equality, never a sense of that. And historically, when Jews were an independent nation, they were a pretty warlike group of people. They provided some of the best gladiators. According to Roman literature, the Jewish knife fighters were considered, kind of elite in there. If you read some of the classical, again, Roman authors, what was some of the rub was Jewish prostitution. Jews were pretty aggressive in going after converts in that period. Judaism did change in certain significant ways after the destruction of the temple and after exile. I think, the reality is, in my personal opinion, that if you read, the Bible and some of the, early literature, there are things in there that we find very difficult to stomach today, in terms of, I'll say as a humanist or broad, even coming from a religious perspective. But 2,000 years of exile and powerlessness kind of gave a different perspective and helped neutralize those things.
Right.
I think Christianity went through that crisis after the Holocaust. That was their historical crisis, and I think in many ways they've met that crisis.
Interesting.
I think Islam is now facing that, where you're no longer the majority, or you see what happened when you come in conflict with other, contact with other groups and other religions, and you have to examine your text and your history and how you relate to other people. And it's no longer simply a power equation necessarily, but it's we're in a different world, a smaller world. We're globalized. We have much more contact together. How are we going to, whatever our religious, beliefs are, get along with the other groups out there? And I think that's a crucial test for all religions.
Sure. And even though the Christianity did go through a reckoning after the Holocaust, there's still a part of the rise in anti-Semitism today. There's anti-Semitism from Islam, but it's not all from Islam. There, left wing, right wing, Christian. What do you attribute this rise, the spike in anti-Semitism in the last 5 to 10 years that we've seen, and really, more recently? I mean, it just continues. This past year, it didn't grow. It's the first year, if you follow the ADL's study, because we were all sheltered in place, right?
Right. So that's exactly. I'm glad you pointed that out, because in some ways, the surface reading is, wow, it didn't grow. That's great news. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, actually, it only declined by a tiny percent. And considering that we were all locked down, it was like 4%. Considering we were all locked down, that's actually pretty scary. On the other hand, I agree. The first, it's the good news, and then not so good news. But I think in the United States, we've had a history of anti-Semitism. Again, we're part of our culture. It's woven into it. I'm speaking to you from New York. New York, as this, probably the man who's credited with founding the city is the Dutchman Peter Stuyvesant, who has statues and high schools and neighborhoods, and is an icon of New York. You read what Stuyvesant wrote about Jews, and by the way, he was a racist and slave as well. But he wrote to his bosses that he doesn't want this Christ killers to be allowed into New York. I think it was 1654 he wrote, and he had to be overridden by his bosses in Amsterdam to allow the first Jews into New York. Fortunately, a few others have followed, and we have a couple of Jews left in New York these days. But then Grant did try to exile Jews from Illinois, and then Lincoln had to override him. And you had this history balanced, of course, by George Washington's famous letter of establishing religious freedom as a hallmark of the United States, and the opportunities for Jews. The reality is, though, that even in the 20th century, anti-Semitism was not far from the surface. Henry Ford.
Father Conyer?
Right, Coughlin. Charles Coughlin. I was actually going to go back to Henry Ford, who was, the father of industrial America. But on the way, he industrialized anti-Semitism by importing the protocols into the United States, and idolized Hitler and had a positive relationship back and forth with him. And again, before people jump in, his descendants and his family totally rejected that aspect of Ford's thinking and ideology and impact on it, and have absolutely no connection with anti-Semitism that I know of today. So please don't run out and start boycotting Ford motor products for that reason.
Yes.
But
we actually, Mark, I'd love for you to come to and visit the museum sometime, because we cover a lot of this history in the museum, but we have the Dearborn Independent, and
right, exactly. So I just want to point out, I just want to jump ahead a little bit and point out that in the latter part of the 20th century, there was actually a series of armed and murders, anti-Semitic attacks in the United States by far-right extremist anti-government groups, the Aryan Nations, the Order, the Offspring, the CSA, other groups like that. These were the groups that murdered the Jewish radio talk show host in Denver in 1984,
Okay.
Alan Berg, and it shot up a JCC in Los Angeles and one in Seattle.
Right.
And there were a
Right.
number. Benjamin Smith in 2000, I think it was, who went on a spree in Chicago where he wounded Jews and shot and killed an African-American basketball coach and Asian Americans. These were, they coined the term Zog, calling the US government the Zionist occupied government. These are the direct, today's far right, extreme right, are the direct descendants of these groups. And in some cases, there are direct connections of individuals and leaders who absorbed some of the ideology. So we've had this history, including violent anti-Semitism. A neo-Nazi, an 88-year-old neo-Nazi, went into the Holocaust Museum in Washington a number of years, like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was, and shot and murdered an African-American security guard because he was the first person that he saw there. The man went to help him, as a matter of fact. But he was targeting a Jewish institution. That was his target.
Well, and it's why one of our peer museums, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, was formed because of the Nazi march in Skokie.
Skokie, exactly. So we tend to forget that these things existed, and these were anti-God. They are the ones who coined the phrase Zog, that the U.S. government is Zionist occupied government, is run by Jews. This was the forerunner of some of the types of groups that we saw marching through the Capitol on January 6th. And then definitely the ones in Charlottesville. The ones in Charlottesville took Nazi slogans and Nazi flags, and took their ideology directly from European far-right anti-Semitic groups. And more recently, groups like Atomwaffen and the Base, who have links to neo-Nazi extremist groups in Europe. And they're responsible for a string of murders and violence. So we've had that history and heritage. We tend to forget about it in some ways, which is good because it shows how good life has been for Jews otherwise. In the United States. It's the most hospitable home for Jews historically that I can think of in the world, perhaps leaving aside Israel, of course. So the situation, Jews have, and this is from the left side, Jews have achieved a certain semblance of success. So they're considered privileged. And, the fact of Jews below the poverty line or Jews of color or things that don't fit into that paradigm are conveniently ignored. But
yeah, it's fascinating. To me, it's so fascinating how much, so many things don't make any sense. You've got saying that Jews, control the world, but then, Nazi propaganda, said that the Jews were worthless and were a drain on society. I mean, there are so many times you hear diametrically opposed, tropes about the Jew, and it really doesn't matter,
No, and so you've hit on one of the core elements, is that anti-Semitism is not rational. It's totally irrational, meaning that there's no logic to it. Jews are the plutocrats who control Wall Street. At the same time, they're the communists who are trying to undermine Wall Street. Jews are, religiously fanatical. No, but they're secular and trying to undermine the tenets of Western civilization. Jews are, Puritans or the libertines. And none of it makes sense in any rational way. I used one of my favorite illustrations of this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which I hope you've never had the opportunity to read, because it's a slog to read through. They're so terribly written. I actually co-wrote a sort of a rebuttal to the protocols a number of years ago. But there's one protocol that actually literally claims, and remember, these were written around, let's say, 1900, roughly. They literally says that at that time, some of the capital cities in Europe, the great cities in Europe, were undergoing their first construction for subways, for underground metros and so on. So these giant tunnels were being built for the subway system. According to the protocols, I forget which one, 16, whatever it is, the idea was that the Jewish financiers who had underwritten this development, had basically somehow or other managed to stock these tunnels with stores of dynamite, with which they threatened to blow up these capital cities, Paris and London and Moscow, etc., Berlin, if the rulers did not follow their commands. Now we're 120 years later, approximately. Europe has been blown to hell numerous times over by all sorts of things, but the one thing that has never been blown up were subway tunnels by dynamite that was stored inside them. And yet people still believe the protocols.
Right.
It just makes no sense whatsoever.
No sense.
But
How do you, well, I mean, I understand that, that the other thing I think that's really prevalent in our society today is, and has been, is the anti-Semitism or the tropes against, Jews control the media, that control Hollywood, that, finance you've touched on with the Rothschilds or George Soros, but it just all stems from the same place, I suppose.
I think it really stems from people who feel very unsettled, who feel unmoored, who feel that there are forces out there that they don't understand, that they can't contend with. And instead of trying to understand and rationally deal with it, instead of trying to figure out apply some critical thinking, what's true, what's not true, kind of, we use the phrase these days, go down the rabbit hole. They find it easy to just sort of, oh, well, I'm just going to, take this one step into this world. And before they know it, sometimes willingly, they found somebody or something that gives them all the answers they're looking for, without much work, without much effort. And it also takes the blame and the responsibility off them.
And shifts it.
Exactly. It's a very comforting feeling to say that, I didn't get that job, not because there was someone better than me, or not because I screwed up and, made this huge mistake or something like that, but because someone didn't want me to get it because they were doing it for someone else. I had no control over it. And in many ways, that's really what we're dealing with today. We have all sorts of issues that are huge issues of society, whether it's even before COVID. We have issues of loss of confidence and trust in government. We have in financial institutions. We have all sorts of social issues about inequality and race and so on. People feeling that they've been left out of the pie, people fighting for their share of the pie, saying that they achieved something and don't want someone else taking it away. There's a lot of tension and a lot of understandable tension. And sometimes instead of confronting it, instead of saying that, it's more, I have to grapple with something and come to difficult decisions or make difficult choices, it's sometimes easier to say, it doesn't have anything to do with me. They're the ones who are keeping me down. If it wasn't for them, everything would be hunky-dory. And Jews, historically, you pointed out the Black Plague. You go from the Black Plague, Nazi, film, their Ivega Yuda, the propaganda film, Eternal Jew, with its image of rats coming out of the sewer overflowing Europe.
We also show that in the museum, literal rats and cockroaches spreading across the
and then you go to protests I can think of one in Columbus, Ohio, that had demonstrators holding up a sign with basically, a rat, a Jew, COVID coming together, basically saying in a book that I just saw was published by but by a notorious anti-Semite, alleging that Israel and Jews were behind the COVID pandemic. It's the same thing, because Jews have fit there. One of the things that we learned about the Holocaust, Yehuda Bauer, the great Israeli scholar, has really hammered this point home, that it's not that the Holocaust was unique. Nothing, if it was unique, there's no reason to study it and learn it, because it means it happened once, but it won't happen again. So it's just frozen in time there, but it was unprecedented. Meaning that something like that had not happened previously, but now it has set a precedent. And once a precedent is broken, it's always easier to do it the second or third or fourth time. The precedent of the conspiracy of blaming Jews for societies or individual ills was set a long time ago. And that is there. Racism was set a long time ago. And that is there. That's why it's easy for some people to fall into those
Sure.
traps.
Well,
Yeah.
so you absolutely, and you bring up racism. What are your thoughts about, how anti-Semitism fits into the current conversations about race and racism in the United States? It's a complicated issue.
It is a complicated issue. I think anti-Semitism has to be a part of the conversation because, as I pointed out, I hope successfully earlier, I think it's structural in many ways. But it is not the only thing that's structural in Western civilization.
Sure, racism, sure.
Exactly. And certainly in U.S. history, if you ask me, I'll answer it. You didn't ask me, but I'll say it. People very often ask me do I think that we're on the verge of another Holocaust, or where do we stand in the United States on these things? Are we the equivalent of Germany 1933 or 38 or something like that? My answer is no, not even close. And if something like that was to happen in the United States, firmly believe that Jews would not be the primary or the first original targets. It would be, because of this issue of precedent that I said earlier, it would be Native Americans. It would be people of color, because they have been targeted already, and it's always easier to repeat. Violence against Jews in the United States was never state organized, was never on a mass scale. We've had these individual, as I pointed out, shootings, and worse the past couple of years than ever before. Pittsburgh was the worst massacre in American Jewish history, but nothing compared to the pogroms, nothing compared to the expulsions that existed in Europe. The precedents in Europe targeted Jews. Those kind of precedents in the United States target other minorities. So I'm not saying that our situation here is either comparable to Nazi Germany or comparable to other groups. But I'm also not into the competition of victims.
That's right. There's nothing to be gained.
Exactly, and they feed off each other, because so often we see the people who are hardcore racists are hardcore anti-Semites. The people that are hardcore anti-Semites are frequently people who are hardcore racists as well, which is, again, going back to what Shahid said, anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. He didn't say only to Jews. He said to democracy, to society. Racism is equally toxic. So I think these are necessary conversations. They're very difficult conversations. You pointed that out very eloquently at the beginning. I think that, it's never easy to reach maturity. This is another stage and step on the way to maturity as a society. There are growing pains. They're really painful sometimes for all involved, but they're necessary and they're important, and they shouldn't be evaded. Otherwise, we're just going to continue down the same path and probably end up aggravating the situation and making it worse.
That gives me a glimmer of hope. You think our growth spurt is about to be over, or?
I'm not sure about that, but I do see some glimmers of hope, and I'll point out one of them. I'll point out will be the most unlikely place I think that people would imagine, which is in Washington D.C., which I think would probably shock many people to think there's anything hopeful associated. But I worked a great deal in one with State Department, Congress, et cetera, and in both houses of Congress, in both the Senate and the House, there are what are called bipartisan task forces on anti-Semitism, each of them chaired by a Democrat and a Republican. Now, some of the members of these task forces, and I know this, I'll say for a fact, would basically have absolutely nothing, no common points of agreement on any topic except anti-Semitism. But that has brought them together to work together on that issue. And my hope is that not only I'm thankful and grateful that this exists and that they are able to overcome their opposition otherwise to come together on this, but I see that as a model, perhaps, that on some fundamental questions, there is enough decency and morality, even in Washington, let me put it that way, which might be the surprise for people, that people who disagree on almost anything else realize that there are certain fundamental core issues that we have to work together on.
Good.
And I think that is the model that gives me hope, makes me realize that so many of the people that I work with on this field are certainly not Jewish, are certainly not American. Some come from very difficult backgrounds. Some have family histories of racism and anti-Semitism, et cetera. And yet they've committed themselves professionally, personally, to working to create a better environment and a better place. And that, to me, that helps keep me going. It's my inspiration.
Absolutely. I think that is a wonderful note to end our discussion on and go to some audience Q&A, because it's fascinating. Your knowledge is amazing, and we could talk all night. But I love ending on a positive note and something that we can all be hopeful about. So thank you for that. It's sometimes we forget to look for the things that really are going right, and that can give us hope. So we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and a couple you've came in and you've answered them. So you're reading people's minds. But here's one, Mark, that let's start with. It says, what changed with the Nazis? How and why did anti-Semitism become so murderous in one of the most cultured countries in Europe?
That's a great question, actually, and I think we're still struggling with it. There are some people who say that there was something special about Germany. I'm not sure that I agree with it. I don't necessarily like to single out. The Holocaust obviously originated and would not have happened without, Nazis who participated in it. But that also lets off all the local collaborators and accomplices,
right,
throughout Europe, without their collaboration, it would not have happened either.
right.
People who handed over, the Jewish population, people who committed acts of murder themselves on the local level, people who never dirtied their hands, but particularly in Western Europe, let's say, collaborated by pointing out who Jews were, rounding them up, and putting them on trains to the east. So it's a problem, I think, that goes beyond Germany. There's something in Germany, in the Nazi Party that enabled it to take root in Germany and to grow in Germany, and that's that part of it is absolutely specific. But it fed off, and I'll keep coming back to this, and I'm sorry for repeating it, but it fed off this structural inbred anti-Semitism that enabled some people, not everybody. There were obviously people in all these countries who sometimes lost their lives in opposition and to protect Jews. But nonetheless, that enabled and participated in the genocide of approximately 6 million Jews. And World War II itself probably would not have started without the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. It was their drive to, have more living space, and the drive to see an eternal enemy, to position themselves. And maybe this is something, again, that's inherent in some aspects of our culture, that you could only define yourself against something else. The Nazis had to find an enemy to fit their needs, and the Jew was the one who fit their needs. So I'm not sure if that's the maybe the best answer I can give in a short notice, in a short form, but we'll go with that.
It's an excellent. It's very complex. I think you answered it beautifully. For people watching tonight who are not as familiar with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, could you give just a brief summary, and who wrote it, how it occurred, and what spread it so quickly?
Okay, the one question I can't answer is who wrote it. No one is 100% sure. We're still trying to come to the bottom of it.
It may have started in France, right?
It's either maybe it's Russian or Ukrainian inspired. It took elements of a French political satire aimed at Napoleon III from about 1840, 50, whatever it was, and plagiarized it, but applied it. And the basic premise of the protocols is that there is a group, a cabal say, of Jewish elders who have decided that they want to take over the world, running the world, but from behind the scenes. And they're going to convince leaders of the world to blackmail them, force them somehow or other, because these people have total contempt for non-Jews. And basically, picture the stereotype of a puppet master with puppets dancing on his strings. That hand holding the puppets are the Jewish hand, but all you see are the puppets dancing, and they're the non-Jewish leaders, ostensible leaders of the world. But the idea is that this small group of Jews is going to take over running the world. And that's the plot and the plan. And they're going to do it by different ways, by taking control of the media, by finances, by undermining sexual mores, by undermining traditional religious, read Christian belief. And it was generally considered for a long time that it was put together by the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, by the Tsar Nicholas and so on, or still meant to support Tsar Nicholas. And it's a little murkier than that now. They first appeared in probably Romania near Kishinev in the early part of the 20th century, segments of it. But nonetheless, it's become literally the Bible of anti-Semitism. It's been thoroughly, as I said, the Times of London in 2021 ran a series where they showed that it was plagiarized from this French text. It's been debunked in certain court trials in Bern in the 1930s in South Africa, even in Russia in more recent times. But nonetheless, it's used all the time and pops up over and over and over again in all sorts of circles. As to quote Henry Ford, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it seems to fit what I wanted the world to look like today, or what I believe the world looks like today. So for those people who want it, it's the conspiracy theory par excellence, or the Bible of anti-Semitism.
Published in every language, right?
Oh, yeah, I can't count how many languages.
Yeah.
And for everyone else, it's literally impossible to read and more impossible to believe.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. So this is a good question that you touched on a little bit. We've long grown accustomed to hearing anti-Semitic remarks from extreme right-wing groups, but now we observe similar views from some progressive or left-wing entities. How do you explain this, or has it always existed on the left and it's just now being acknowledged?
I think it's always existed on the left. I referred briefly to Marx earlier, and Marx, by the way, had some incredibly racist things to say in his letters to Engels. You just could not repeat those today, what he wrote. He's not necessarily the nicest person in the world, but there was always this strain, and even if you go back, the communist world and this, Soviet Russia, weaponized anti-Semitism in many different ways. Stalin was a virulent anti-Semite, and only his death basically stopped another pogrom from taking place. He had laid plans, it was called the Doctor's Plot, using a pretext of charging mostly Jewish doctors with, being against, maybe trying to assassinate him and against, the Soviet rule, was planning a large-scale action against Jews. Today, we see the theme that very often, this was popularized actually in parts of the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, that Israel is a Nazi state, and Zionists collaborated with the Nazis, which has, again, no basis in fact or history whatsoever, and basically accuses Israel of being a capitalist state, a state of Western imperialism, or a state of that's committing acts of genocide and apartheid itself. This is setting up the idea that Israel is, a white Western imperialist state, and Jews as the Jewish state. Jews are in that category because, again, some people need an opponent, need an enemy as their demon, as their stereotype to push against. But it's been there historically, it's been present in the far left throughout its history, basically. And I think basically,
well, you said in the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah,
too.
Right. And any extremist movement that we know of historically has had at least a vein of anti-Semitism in it for whatever reason. That's a different question. But I don't think you can find an extremist movement that's really been exempt from anti-Semitism at all.
Fascinating. I mean, horrifying, but fascinating.
Sure.
Can you talk briefly about the difference between anti-Semitism and race-based hatred, or do you see them as similar?
There are elements of similarity and dissimilarity at the same time. You can't say that anti-Semitism is only race-based, because the Jews are obviously many different races, or however you want to describe it. A Black Jew is certainly going to face discrimination on multiple fronts, possibly. A A Jew who looks more white may not. But that's not the only marker of Jewishness. And that's where just assigning everything to a racial category, both in terms of discrimination and in terms of measures to exist and oppose it, fails. It just simply fails the eye test and every other test possibly. And that's where anti-Semitism is both a part of racism in general, but it's also unique. And this probably applies to every form of racism and discrimination as well. That there's a certain umbrella, if you want to,
Right.
a holistic umbrella of discrimination that exists, but there are also particularities that if you're really going to deal with the issue that you're facing with, you have to acknowledge, understand, and be open to facing those particularities and really dealing with them. So, race-based does not necessarily address religious anti-Semitism or social anti-Semitism or things like that.
Sure. That I guess last question for the evening, because we're almost out of time. But this is an important one. Are you seeing anything new in modern day anti-Semitism, or is it really, just the same thing we've seen for millennia? Resurgence of the anti-Semitism that's been around for centuries.
Well, obviously, it's some of the forms are different, but they're rooted in many, I'll say, traditional forms of anti-Semitism. We've touched upon that, whether it's the idea of Jews as carrier of a plague, or dual loyalty, or conspiracies, or things like that. There is, to quote a great Jewish writer in the Bible, there's nothing new under the sun in that regard. But the reality is, what we are seeing different is, I think, the method of transmission of these trends. The social media has made
how rapidly it
much more
spreads.
accessible. I'm actually, I started researching this 20 years. I think I was one of the first people to start researching and publishing on this like 20 years ago. And one of the first articles that I published was called "The Internet is More Powerful Than a Sword," and that was taken from a quote by a neo-Nazi from like 1995 or something like that, where he recognized the potency of the internet at that point. This was before social media even. And he said, in those days, you mentioned the Skokie March, you referenced it. Well, they went out and they had a lawsuit and they had to face physical risk, and there were people yelling and screaming at them and shouting and so on and so forth. And, they could lose their jobs, and they could get punched in the nose, and, whatever.
It was uncomfortable.
Now you sit at home and there's no gatekeeper. You just put out whatever you want, and you're in the vanguard of an international movement. And you play into it. There's no accident that the shooter in Christchurch, which was obviously in the mosque there, which was not necessarily, was anti-Semite, but that was not an anti-Semitic act, obviously. And Pittsburgh and so on live streamed some of their stuff. And that's no accident there. That has changed the game because it's made it much more global. The impact is greater. We also hear more about it, so it spirals and incites. I could show you now pictures of some of these shooters from the church in North Carolina, Dylan Roof and Tarrant in Christchurch, etc. They're now turned into religious icons. They're literally postings out there that have them pictured as saints.
Wow.
Airbrushed, their faces photoshopped onto traditional religious forms. This is because they're now in everyone's computer screen. Before, you had to look for this stuff, you had to find this stuff, you had to expose yourself. So that has changed the game. It's globalized it. It's made much more intimate, much more powerful, and we don't know yet how to cope with that because we have the corresponding issue of freedom of speech. And what the internet was supposed to be a liberating factor that brought everyone, gave them a voice and connected people. How do we deal with the negative without losing the positive? We're still finding our way in there. So that is, I think, significantly different than the past. The other part, I think, that I'll say, which is somewhat depressing to me, or more than somewhat depressing, is we're seeing some mainstreaming of anti-Semitism today that did not exist previously. We're seeing it in Congress, in government circles. Again, both parties, different sides, different
Right.
ways they're saying it, but the problematic statements and actions, we're seeing it in celebrity circles
Sure.
of people making comments from athletes and entertainers and things like
Sure.
that are just really disheartening to see figures with such mainstream appeal and centered in our society, and in some cases leaders of society, whether political or thought leaders or cultural leaders, embracing, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, anti-Semitic tropes. And this is scary because one of the things what the Holocaust had done was to marginalize that in our society. And I'm struck constantly. I don't know if you saw this, but Nancy Pelosi, who, and I'm not talking this as a political statement in any way, is a hardened veteran politician who's basically, you could say, seen everything, and you would not imagine her shook by anything. But yet, our press conference after January 6th focused on, and you referenced this, the man who's wearing the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt, and that was the one that she spoke about. And I kept wondering to myself why that, of all this, the symbols and T-shirts and garb that were, out there, why did that? And then it hit me, and I think this is what she was saying. I'm not sure. Maybe my interpretation, I'll put it, of what she was saying, was that what the Holocaust was, on certain ways, it was a watershed moment in Western society. Afterwards, we created these institutions, whether it's international bodies like the United Nations or the EU. And I'm not saying whether they're successful or not. There are many issues related to them of anti-Semitism and others associated or unassociated issues that are, beside the point. But their ideal at least, was to create a world where that kind of thing could not be repeated. Obviously, there were failures, the Balkans, Rwanda, but the goal was there. Fine. Concepts like human rights and civil rights and crimes against humanity and genocide and war crimes tribunals and all that grew out of that same period and that same focus of trying to make sure that we do not go down that path again. What I see now are attempts to undermine those. And that's not a quote Democrat, Republican, right, left, progressive, conservative issue. That's an issue attacking what I'll use the term liberal democracy in its foundations. It's an attempt to turn back the clock to a time where you could judge people, characterize them, and oppress them by what their beliefs were, or the color of their skin, or any of the other markers of discrimination that we're familiar with. This is a fundamental core issue that I think some of these attacks represent, and I think that's what Nancy Pelosi was kind of hinting at, that Auschwitz was the epitome of where that kind of racist, racial, anti-Semitic thinking could lead. And yet to minimize it by calling it a camp, by endorsing it by calling it a camp or whatever, was a target of all we've learned since then. And that, I think, is where we're at now, that we have this fundamental challenge as a society that is maybe centered through resurgent anti-Semitism and the mainstream of anti-Semitism. But I think that's what we have to meet. That's the challenge of our time today.
Absolutely. Well, it needs to be a wake-up call. Absolutely. Well, Mr. Weitzman, you've given us a lot to think about, and it has been such a pleasure talking with you. And I really appreciate you sharing your incredible expertise and knowledge with our community. It's really, you've taught us all a lot, and it's been a wonderful way to kick off this series. So thank you so much. And for all of you that joined us tonight, thank you for being on this journey with us. I hope that you will join us for the next conversation about anti-Semitism in the United States, and it will be on June 3rd. So we hope to see you then. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much.